everyone, welcome. I'm Lydia and today I'm going to walk you through the tutorial for my new pattern, the ME2091. This pattern is this wonderful high neck, horizontal bust seam, fit and flare bodice ending in godets, gorgeous summer flowy dress. I think you're gonna love it. It's very unique and I've already worn it out quite a few times. There are two sleeve styles. There's the cap sleeves and also the flared sleeves, and I'm going to be walking through both of those instructions in this tutorial today. So let's get started. I had some lovely linen ginghams to work with, and I cut some of the pieces on the bias to showcase the style lines, but please be aware that this is not part of the pattern. If you plan to cut anything on the bias, you will need to purchase more fabric than recommended. But this won't change anything about the sew along, and I do recommend trying cutting some pieces on the bias because it looks really pretty with this pattern. Make sure you take a look at the back of the pattern envelope for sizes and notions and read through the instruction booklet provided, especially the glossary of terms if you're unfamiliar with paper patterns. The seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters unless otherwise mentioned. Cut out all your pieces and overlock the sections as shown in the green. The rest of the overlocked finishing will be completed as we sew the seams. Start by fusing the interfacing to the wrong side of each matching fabric section of piece 8 and 9, and I'm using a press cloth just to protect my iron from any adhesive. Stay stitch the side edges of the front, piece 2, from the upper edge to the upper notch, and the curve edges between the dot and the lower notch. Also stay stitch the side curved edges of the side front, piece 3, between the dot and lower notch. I totally misread the instructions and stay stitched in a completely different area, but you don't have to make that same mistake. With the right sides together, pin each side front to the front at the side front seams, matching the dots and notches, and stitch from the upper edge to the dots. Make sure you don't go past this. It's very important for applying the godets later. Then you can press the seam either open or press it towards the center as the instructions say. With right sides together, pin the lower edge of the bodice front, piece 1, to the upper edge of the front, side front assembly, matching notches. Then stitch in place. After that, I overlocked that seam as you can see and pressed the seams towards the bodice. I did this in sections so that I would keep that beautiful curve of the bodice. Next is finishing the tie ends. I did this a bit differently from the pattern instructions just because I'm used to this technique. So I used a size 18 bias binding maker. It folds the sides to the center and then I can iron it. Once that's done, I fold in one end and then fold lengthwise and press in place. Then I'm going to sew along this fold, and to get it started, I find that a piece of tracing paper really helps get it going. Now I have piece 4 and 5 on the table, and at the center back of piece 4, pin the tie end centering over the upper dot, and having the raw edges even. And then you can stitch those in place. Also, you can stay stitch the side curve edge of the back above the waist edge and between the dot and single notch. I did this wrong again, but if you follow the green guidelines, you'll do it right. And I actually made a little snip at the waist area when cutting out piece 4. I did this to align the zipper sides evenly later on. So feel free to do that if you think that would help you as well. For piece 5, stay stitch the side curve edges between the dot and single notch. Also did this wrong, but you don't have to because I showed you the proper area to do this. With the right sides together, pin each side back to the back pieces at the side back seam, matching the dots. And then you're going to stitch from the upper edge to the dots. And then the instructions say to press the seam towards the back, but of course I pressed it open. This is just a preference of mine, but you can of course press it in one direction. Also, it would be helpful to clip the seam allowance on the back side to help it lay flat. I found this really made a difference when I wore it for the back to just sit more flat. Stitch the back to the front at the shoulders. Your shoulder seams should already be overlocked or zigzagged, but I had to do this before sewing. And of course, as with all the seams, you can overlock them together after sewing the seam and then just press them to one side. In this case, you would press it towards the back shoulder. But of course, I like to press the seam open, so that's what I did. Take the front and back facings and stitch the front facing piece 8 to the back facing piece 9 at the shoulders. Then you're going to finger press the seam open, so that just means pressing it out with your fingers instead of getting the iron out. And then you're going to finish the long unnotched edge of the facing with either an overlock or zigzag stitch. Pin the facing to the front neck and back edges, right sides together, matching the notches, centers, and seams, and stitch. Start and end the stitch at the notches on the back edge. This is important because later we're going to have to put the zipper in and finish the facing over the zipper. Next, trim the seams around the curve of the neckline from notch to notch. Don't trim beyond there. And then to help the neckline lay flat, we can clip into the seam and then turn it out. Next, we're going to understitch the facing neck and the back edges as far as possible. So as you can see, to understitch, I'm turning the seam allowance towards the facing, then stitching close to the seam on the facing side. I ended up about 1.5 to 2 inches from both corners. Then you're going to turn everything out and press. Keeping the free lower edges of the back facing out of the way, on the outside, pin the right side of the zipper face down on the right side of the zipper opening at the center back. Make sure that the coil is along the seam line. So typically these invisible zippers are about 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter wide, maybe a little bit more. So you're not going to be able to line it up exactly with the edge of the fabric. So mine is moved over about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters so that the coil is on that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance stitch line. Next, I'm taking a contrasting thread and just basting the tape in place. This really makes it so much easier to sew. And my zipper is a bit longer, so we're going to stop at the notch on the center back piece. So position your invisible zipper foot over the coil, backstitch at the start, and then you're going to sew along the coil. And to get nice and close to the coil, I'm moving the coil out of the way a little bit as I sew so that it truly is an invisible zipper. One thing that really helps is actually ironing the zipper coil open a bit, and that really makes it easier to sew right close to that coil. Then I'm stopping and backstitching right in line with that notch. Next, I close the zipper, and on the other side I mark the end, and I also marked where I made a little notch for the waist, just so that I know that my zipper is not shifted. It's going to be perfectly in place. I love to do this on all of my zippers, and so I highly recommend this for you. Then I open that zipper and I place it on the other side, right side down, and pin everything in place, pin where I marked it. Then I go ahead and baste it in place again and repeat the same steps. Next, I close the zipper and check that it's invisible from the outside. And I pull the free ends of the zipper tape away from the seam allowance and then pin the remaining center back seam together below the zipper. I make sure that my regular zipper foot is going to be out of the way of the zipper, and then I start from the bottom of the dress and sew up to just where the zipper seam ends. I actually got a bit of a curve in that last end part of the seam, so I just went ahead and stitched another stitch down to correct that curve because it will show up on the outside. So I took the original stitch out after this. Then I pressed that open and I pinned the end of the zipper in place along the seam allowance. And I didn't show this, but you can tack that in place on each side of the seam allowance. Next, we're going to open out the back opening edges of the dress, rolling the zipper teeth away from the opening edge, and then turn the back facing to the outside with right sides together, and pin the back edges of the dress and facing together. Then stitch the remaining back edges of the dress, connecting to the previous stitching. And stitch in a more gradual shape than my example because that didn't look so good and I had to fix it. Then you can trim the rest of the seam above the zipper. Don't trim the center back edges where the zipper is. Turn the facing back to the inside again and just press everything in place. And I didn't show this, but you can also tack the facing to the shoulder seams. Now with right sides together, pin the side back sections to the side front sections at the side seams, matching dots. Stitch from the upper edge to the dot, as we have with all of the vertical seams on the bodice. Then press the seam open or to one side. Moving on to the sleeve. You're going to ease stitch the cap of the sleeve, piece 10 or 11, between the outer dots. Also make sure the side seams are overlocked. Next, we're going to place the sleeve right side together and stitch the sleeve seam. To finish the sleeve hems, I opted for a rolled hem, but you could also just go by the pattern instructions. To roll the hem, I like to start at the seam, so I snip back the seam to reduce bulk and then fold it over. I get it in the machine, sew a few stitches, and then pull the edge into the roll guide of the foot, and then feed it in and let it do its thing. With right sides together, pin the sleeve into the armhole with the center small dot at the shoulder seam, matching the underarm seams, notches, and remaining small dots. Then you can adjust the ease. I didn't find that the flared sleeve had much ease, so I really didn't have to adjust anything. Whereas the cap sleeve did need some adjusting. I think it will depend on the fabric you use. And then you can stitch it in place. Then I overlock this seam, trimming about 1/4 inch as I go. Now I'm going to show you how to sew the godets to the dress. So I start by pinning one side from the hem to the dot, and I make sure that the dot only sits on the side of the skirt that I am sewing it on. I move all the other seam allowance out of the way. If you have pressed your seams to one side, you won't have to do this. You can just pin it at the dot and then pin it to the other side. So I'm making sure that the dot is lined up with the end of the stitching on the dress. I don't want to sew over the seams of the dress. Then I get it into the machine, backstitch to start, again making sure you're not going over the dress seam, and then sew down to the hem. I line up the other side and sew it starting from the hem. And when I come close to the dot, I'm moving that seam allowance out of the way. I actually didn't get super close to the dress stitch on the back side only, so it was a bit misaligned, so I ended up taking it out and readjusting so that everything was aligned properly. This is how it will look, and then it needs some finishing. Next, I overlock the seam with the godet side facing up. Then I press all of the seam allowance towards the godet. So you can complete all the rest of your godets, and then we're moving on to the hem. So I did a little trick for the hem, kind of a shortcut. So I increase the differential feed on my sewing machine, which ever so slightly gathers the fabric as you sew it. So I sewed along the hem, and that gave it enough of a gather to be able to fold it in neatly. And then I just sewed along the overlocked edge to finish and then pressed it in place. And now you have your completed dress. I would love to see what you make. Be sure to use the hashtag ME2091 if you make this dress and tag me at Lydia Naomi Studio. Also tag simplicity_creative_group and we'll be able to see and share your makes. Thank you so much for watching.